Snow had just begun to fall over Moscow, light and quiet, like a hush before something sacred. In the still air of a grey morning, the Kremlin walls stood tall, unmoved by time. But something new was arriving. Not a storm, not a threat. A man from Africa, whose silence often spoke louder than thunder. Captain Ibrahim Traore stood at the window of the Burkina Faso presidential aircraft, arms folded behind his back, gaze steady. The world below was frozen, unfamiliar, foreign. But within him a fire burned, quiet, disciplined, ancestral, and full of purpose. He had not come to bow. He had come to build. Earlier that week in Ouagadougou, he had walked barefoot through his garden at dawn, grounding himself before the journey. This visit to Moscow, though diplomatic, was more than a meeting. It was a message, a statement that African nations would no longer orbit global powers like satellites. They would walk shoulder to shoulder, sovereign, dignified, unapologetic. Preparations had been meticulous. A military send-off, intelligence briefings, economic dossiers, a carefully chosen delegation. Every detail reflected the new Africa that Traore envisioned, calculated, calm, fully in control of its destiny. By the time the aircraft touched down on Russian soil, snow had blanketed the runway edges like a fresh page waiting to be written on. The wheels kissed the tarmac. The engines sighed, and in that cold ceremonial moment, the weight of two continents quietly converged. A formal reception awaited him. Russian military officers in thick coats, flags from both nations raised beside a ceremonial platform, and a small cluster of reporters at a respectful distance. Yet something, or rather someone, was missing. As Traore descended the aircraft stairs, flanked by two bodyguards, he moved not like a man seeking applause, but like one carrying the memory of Sankara in his spine. His eyes swept over the line of welcoming officers. He had witnessed enough military rituals to know their rhythm. One salute was not offered. A tall, stern Russian officer stood stiffly with arms at his sides. He did not raise his hand in salute. He did not nod. He did not acknowledge. At first, the moment passed like a blink, barely a pause in the ceremony. But for those attuned to diplomacy, it was deafening. In military protocol, a missed salute to a visiting head of state is not merely an oversight, it is a message. And in Moscow, messages are never accidental. Messages are rarely sent by mistake. Behind the officer's silence, there was no chaos, no outrage, no visible reaction. Traore didn't flinch. He didn't slow his stride. He walked past the man as if he hadn't seen him at all. But Commandant Ouattara, his longtime protector, noticed. So did the rest of the Burkina Faso delegation. And far more critically, so did the Kremlin's internal observers. Inside the Kremlin compound, where live security feeds streamed into a central diplomatic intelligence room, the moment was replayed within minutes. Frame 34, a Russian protocol advisor said, "That's the one. Watch it again." Later that day, while the Burkina Faso delegation was being escorted to their first bilateral briefing, the incident had already reached President Vladimir Putin's desk. Putin was known for his strategic calm, a man who spoke in silences and acted in shadows. But when the advisor leaned in and whispered, "One of our officers failed to salute Captain Traore on the tarmac," his jaw tightened. Putin asked only one question. "Did he see him?" "Yes, sir. Direct eye contact, no salute." He remained still. Putin didn't raise his voice. He simply pressed a finger to his desk and said, "That's an insult. Handle it." Back in the diplomatic quarters, Traore remained composed. He said nothing about the moment. His team whispered. His aides speculated, but he remained silent. Later that night, in a private room, Ouattara finally spoke. "Mon capitaine, I know what I saw." "The man disrespected you," Traore replied without turning his head. "Then let his actions speak for him. Ours must speak louder." The next morning, during a scheduled tour of a Russian defense research facility, the protocol team was unexpectedly reshuffled. An unfamiliar face greeted the Burkina Faso president. "Monsieur le Président," the man said in near-perfect French, "you are kindly requested to attend a revised ceremony today by direct instruction from the Kremlin." Traore raised an eyebrow. "A revised ceremony?" "Yes, sir." A formal salute. "In your honor." What happened that afternoon would ripple across two continents. Beneath a frozen sky in front of rolling cameras, a full battalion of Russian ceremonial guards stood in formation at Red Square, a location typically reserved for Russia's most sacred national tributes. Traore's motorcade arrived. The music of the Russian military band began to rise, echoing off stone walls like the sound of history itself. This time the officer who had refused to salute was nowhere in sight. Instead, a higher-ranking commander stepped forward with solemnity and delivered a crisp, extended salute to President Ibrahim Traore. Then a second officer approached and handed him a document. In front of cameras with reporters watching and flags fluttering in the cold wind, the Russian commander read aloud, "By executive order from the office of the President of the Russian Federation, we recognize the state visit of Captain Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso as one of strategic importance. In honor of his leadership, composure, and strength, we extend full ceremonial recognition and an apology for any breach of protocol." The crowd did not cheer. This was not a celebration. It was an act of restoration, an acknowledgement that respect is not given because of power, but because of presence. Later that evening, President Vladimir Putin met with Traore in private. Their conversation was not recorded. No aides were present, only two leaders, two minds, two men who had long ceased being naive about how the world worked. "You handled the situation with restraint," Putin said, opening the discussion. Traore nodded. "Restraint is not weakness," he replied. "It is strength wearing patience." Putin smirked faintly, then handed him a sealed envelope. Inside was the order of permanent dismissal for the officer who had refused to salute. Traore barely glanced at it. "I am not here to destroy a man's career," he said softly, "only to affirm my country's honor." Putin nodded once. Then came silence, the kind only understood by those who carry nations on their backs. News of the Red Square salute spread rapidly across West Africa. Headlines read, "Russia honors Burkina Faso after diplomatic misstep. Traore earns Moscow's respect without saying a word." In classrooms, soldiers recounted the story, not of confrontation, but of a man who stood tall by standing still. In a rural village outside Bobo-Dioulasso, a teacher paused mid-lesson and held up a printed photo of the Red Square salute. "This," she said, "is how we carry ourselves when the world tries to ignore us. We don't beg to be seen, we make it impossible not to be." That night, as the jet engines warmed for the return to Ouagadougou, Traore looked out once more over the lights of Moscow. He didn't speak of what had happened. He didn't need to, because dignity doesn't echo loudly in headlines. It echoes in memory. And in that memory, he had already won. The return flight to Burkina Faso was quiet, not in sound, but in spirit. The cabin hummed with routine, aides reviewing documents, Commandant Ouattara scribbling field notes, crew members offering refreshments, but Traore remained still, eyes fixed on the dark clouds ahead, unmoving. He wasn't angry. He wasn't proud. He was reflective. Moments like this weren't about victory or defeat. They were about legacy, the kind passed down through generations. His grandfather used to say, "The loudest man in the room is often the weakest." And today, once again, he had seen the truth of that. The officer who refused to salute hadn't insulted him personally. He had insulted the idea that an African man, dressed in the cloth of his people, with no Western accent or elite family name, could arrive as an equal and be received as one. But the world was changing, and it was no longer asking for permission. As the presidential jet descended over the red dust of Ouagadougou, dusk was falling. The sun hung low, golden and fierce, as if blessing the land for having waited so patiently. Traore stepped down from the aircraft to a quieter reception than before, not because the enthusiasm had faded, but because the people had heard the story. They didn't need fireworks. They had found something more powerful: respect. From the students lining the fences to the elders who had come just to see him walk, their silence was reverence, a quiet pride. As his boots touched the tarmac, a soldier standing at attention beside the stairs saluted without hesitation. Traore returned it. That same evening, in a modest presidential chamber surrounded by no more than a few key staff members and Commandant Ouattara, Traore reviewed the final diplomatic brief from Moscow. It included not only President Putin's formal apology, but also confirmation of a new defense accord, the upcoming opening of a Russian trade office in Ouagadougou, and unexpectedly an addendum. Upon formal approval, Red Square ceremonial protocol will extend full head of state honors to any future delegation from Burkina Faso, beginning with Captain Ibrahim Traore. This shall include military salute, flag ceremony, and full diplomatic guard. He read the line twice, then quietly closed the folder. He didn't smile, but his eyes softened just a little. Ouattara broke the silence. "Captain, the Russians, they moved for you, for us." Traore looked up. "No," he replied. "They moved for the truth." In the days that followed, the incident, and more importantly, the response, swept through African media. On a political panel in Abidjan, a commentator leaned forward and said, "This is a new kind of diplomacy." Traore didn't demand respect. He stood inside it, and the world adjusted. In Ghana, a university debate class used the event to explore the nuances of soft power versus hard power. In Mali, a cartoon in a local paper depicted a tall, silent Traore walking past a slouching soldier, with the caption, "You may ignore my salute, but you will never ignore my presence." But perhaps the most profound impact wasn't on television, in newspapers, or echoed from podiums. It was in the shift, the quiet, almost invisible shift, in how young Africans began to speak about leadership. They no longer praised those who shouted the loudest or showed force. Instead, they began to praise those who didn't flinch. A week later, Traore visited a school in Koudougou as part of a routine rural development tour. The students didn't ask about roads or trade. One small girl raised her hand and asked, "Sir, is it true they didn't salute you in Russia?" There was a pause in the room. Traore knelt to her eye level and softly replied, "Yes, but I saluted them anyway because sometimes respect isn't returned. It's taught." The teacher stood still, hand over heart. The children sat in quiet awe. Meanwhile, in Russia, the dismissed officer, whose name was quietly removed from official records, was no longer spoken of. The Kremlin issued no condemnation, but neither did it defend him. When asked in a closed-door meeting whether further statements should be made, Putin reportedly replied, "No, we've shown enough." The world watched. That is enough. And in a rare symbolic gesture, Putin ordered a commemorative plaque to be placed in a restricted wing of Red Square's military protocol building. It read, "Let no guest of honor ever be received with less than full recognition. Respect is not requested, it is owed." The moment could have faded like many diplomatic incidents, but this one didn't, because it wasn't about politics. It was about posture. And the posture of a man who didn't raise his voice or his hand, but stood with such presence that the world rose to meet him. That year, when Traore addressed the African Union Summit, his speech was brief, just a few minutes, but one line was etched into every mind present. Africa's dignity will never be negotiated. It will only be revealed in how we walk, how we speak, and how we wait. The room rose in applause, not just for what he said, but because everyone knew it came from a man who had lived it just days earlier, on snow-covered ground thousands of miles from home. And back in Moscow, in a quiet diplomatic office rarely visited by the press, a photograph sat in a frame on a shelf, a man in uniform standing alone in Red Square, receiving the salute that should have been given days earlier. No caption, no fanfare. Just a reminder, even in silence, Africa now speaks.